Hello, my name is Rebecca Chung, and I am the Director of 21 CSLA State Center. Welcome to our Research Practice Webinar number 9, Principal Resilience, Supporting Principals During Challenging Times. Before we begin our webinar today, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement as a part of the UC Berkeley community. 21 CSLA State Center is headquartered at UC Berkeley, and we acknowledge that our university sits on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other Verona Band descendants. Every member of Berkeley and 21 CSLA has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Furthermore, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area communities today. In recognition of this, members of the 21 CSLA State Center and Berkeley School of Education contribute to the Shumi Land Tax, a voluntary financial contribution that non-Indigenous people living on traditional Chochenyo and Ohlone territory make to support the critical work of the Sogorea Teo Land Trust. If you too have benefited or continue to benefit from the use and occupation of ancestral and unceded land, we encourage you to visit Native Land, California to learn more about the land you occupy and find meaningful ways to contribute and support the Indigenous stewards of that land. Again, welcome to 21 CSLA's Research Practice Webinar number 9, focused on principal resilience, supporting principals during challenging times. 21 CSLA is the California 21st Century California School Leadership Academy, dedicated to the professional learning and support of our educational leaders at the teacher, site, and district level to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Headquartered at UC Berkeley Graduate of Education, it is led in partnership with UCLA School of Education, the California Subject Matter Projects, and 7 regional academies across the state. 21 CSLA is sponsored and supported by the California Department of Education, the State Board of Education, and the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence. 21 CSLA is guided by its equity statement that leaders for equity transform education to improve access, opportunity, and inclusion for students and adults, especially those who are systematically marginalized and historically underserved, so that they can thrive. Our essential mission and charge is to build the capacity for education equity leadership in education across the state of California. Our webinar today will focus on recent research findings made by Dr. Young, who is a professor at UC Berkeley, who has helped us to investigate issues of principal resilience. Her findings, after the presentation of her findings, we have invited 2 leadership coaches who work in 21 CSLA, providing professional learning to the state, to share how their experiences as leadership coaches supporting California leaders connects to the survey results. Then we will have an opportunity for audience members to provide questions that they would like to ask to the panelists through the chat. And I will curate the questions and ask them to our guests, the leadership coaches, and also our guest researcher. And they will dialogue about the questions that you raise. At the end, we'll have a few minutes for closing remarks from our scholar, Dr. Young. And then we will move forward with some important announcements and feedback collection about our webinar process. And so without further ado, let's begin our webinar. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chunyan Yang, who is an assistant, soon to be associate professor of school psychology in the School of Education at UC Berkeley. Dr. Young's research interests focus on understanding how school members interact with their ecological context to find their resilience individually and collectively when facing risks and adversities such as bullying, teacher-targeted violence, and mental health challenges. She has collaborated deeply with 21 CSLA State Center on principal resilience research and with the Oakland Unified School District on broader educational resilience issues. Dr. Young's research has been recognized and supported by the Society of Hellman Fellows, the National Academy of Education, the Spencer Foundation, the Society of the Study of School Psychology. She's also a recipient of the 2019 Early Career Award for Distinguished Scholarly Contributions to Bullying, Abuse, and Prevention. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chunyan Yang.
Thank you, Rebecca, for your introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. So glad to be here to share some of our research findings from the Principal Resilience Project. So before I started and highlight some of the research findings, I would like to just give a little bit background about the study. In terms of the purpose of the project was really trying to understanding the impact of several elevated issues that faced by school leaders during the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic has drastically impacted the work of school leaders and leadership practices. So in responding to the pandemic, school leaders have not only engaged in some of the effective communications and facilitate sense makings, but also try to adaptive and attend to the well-being and health of their employees and colleagues. So in the past 2 years, we know that United States also experiencing waves of political movement and social movement, which related to the global pandemic, but also social epidemics. So leaders are in California are faced a lot of financial constraints and anticipated state budget cuts, as well as cope with the remote instructions for a large portion of the school years. So schooling principals were put in these positions not only to practice crisis leadership, but also lead schools with equity, which is very unprecedented, challenging roles for many principals. On the research side, scholars has been studied understanding some of the how principals to navigate those challenges and trying to find the resilience. But the majority of those findings has been reported anecdotally or based on some smaller scale study looking at like case studies and looking at samples from a smaller group. So one of the, to address some of the limitations, this study was trying to explore a larger patterns using survey design to capture some larger patterns of leaders' experiences, particularly from those from different demographic background and different school experiences, and to use those findings to inform the practice in leadership. We also, by focusing on the principles well-being, psychological well-being, and mental health, we're hoping that the finding can help to address some of the research as well as practice gap between the psychology and educational leadership. So this project has been informed by two very related studies. One of them is the Changemaker project that has been led by Dr. Soraya Sidens in our leadership programs. And it's also built upon the Teacher Resilience Project that my research team has been collaborating with Oakland School District in the past 2 years, trying to understand the teachers' experiences. I also want to emphasize that this is really a product of teamwork, and it has been putting a lot of efforts and work from our wonderful graduate students, and some of them are here today, like Max Domsky, Shechin Ling, and Ellen Law, as well as Kim Ballard, and they help to executing in terms of data collection, participant recruitment, and data analysis. So really appreciate the efforts and contribution to this project. So for this, we called it Principal Resilience Survey Study. And the main research question that we're trying to answer is how do California principals to describe and experiencing the stressors, how do they perceive the well-being, and how do they find the resilience across different stages of school transition during the COVID? And what we're trying to find out is what are some of the main stressors that principals are experiencing during the COVID at the different stages, but also how do they impact the well-beings, and what are some of the protective and risk factors that contribute to their well-being and mental health, especially the compassion fatigue. The ultimate goal is trying to understand what are some of the effective strategies that has been practiced or utilized by principals to help them to find the resilience and to find the fulfillment and positive strengths from the work. So that's some of the three. So my presentation today is going to focus on these three areas and try to highlight some of the research findings. A little bit background about when this project is being started. It was started back to right after the outbreak of COVID and spring 2021. That was our first wave of study was conducted. And we also did a follow-up study in last fall. So you can see that those two wave study were conducting the very different contexts. One is that school are transitioned from in-person to the virtual or distant learning phase. And then the second wave is during the time that majority of schools are transitioned back to school. So it really captured different kind of school contexts and experiences of principals. And in both waves, over 200 principals has been participating in the study. In the wave 2, about 50 principals has been returning from the wave 1, which gave us opportunity to looking at their experiences longitudinally across those two times. And the study data has been collected by the online surveys that distributed by 21 CSLA, regional academy directors, and leadership programs from UC Berkeley as well as UCLA, as well as the CDE listserv. So here we really want to thank you for all of the participants who help us to collect the data, gain the information from your experiences, and to help to make us make sense of what experiencing and to inform our leadership practice. So moving into the first area of research finding, what are some top stressors are experiencing by school principals? As you can see from this figure, this shows some of the top stressors identified by our school leader during the first school years. During that wave 1, and we surveyed stressors more than this 7 or 8 stressors, but those are the ones that listed or rated as the most elevated stressors. Not surprisingly, the very top stressors are principals concerned about school reopening in the fall 2021. And there's a lot of uncertainties what a school looks like during that time. And there's also a lot of pressures about how to meet the immediate needs of the school community, as well as those technology related issues when schools are just started to adapt it to the virtual or distant learning. And school family members and individuals' health safety concerns, district policies, school climate, and as well as family issues. Those are other top stressors that reported by principals. As we move into the school year 21 to 22, we can see that some of the stressors got shift, especially looking at the additional duties surrounding public health mandates, which becomes one of the top stressors during the time that schools are transitioned back. And also, not surprisingly, staff shortage is another top stressor that expressed by school principals. And some of the communication issues and policy reinforcement in terms of pandemic protocols. And in terms of the needs of school community, mental health, well-being, climate, and health safety issues continue to stay at those top stressors experiencing by school leaders. In our second wave survey, instead of, in addition to looking at some of the Likert scale ratings, we also asked principals to use open-ended question to list additional stressors that experiencing in addition to the one that we surveyed. And one of the things that came out emerged from those more open-ended research responses are principals concerned about district politics as well as organizational structures and practices, which is some kind of a newer stressors coming out during the second wave. Okay, so that are some of the top stressors that we have seen from the survey. And our second research question is trying to understand how those stressors impact principals' well-being, their mental health, and as well as their adjustment. We know that well-being could be interpreted by different people, and here we are using some of the key concepts to try to capture some of the indicators of well-being. One of them is, we call it compassion fatigue. So we perceive compassion fatigue as a more of this multidimensional construct, including not just teachers or principals' work-related chronic stress, but also the stress coming from taking care of the colleagues or witnessing the traumas of their people that they're supporting. So that secondary traumatic stress is also considered part of the well-being or indicators of the well-being. And some example here shows that how we kind of like using this survey items to capture those, such as asking principals to what extent that they feel overwhelmed when they try to cope with different kind of demands from their jobs. But in terms of secondary traumatic stress, we ask principals to what extent that they feel distracted with listening to or witnessing students and family stories and situations. So in addition to looking at direct indicators of those compassion fatigue or well-being, we're also looking at some of the internal and external factors that could contribute to the mental health or psychological wellness. And one of them, more from the external factors, is looking at professional support. Refers to some job-related support that principals seek out when they need help that goes beyond what the school sites can provide. For example, we ask them to what extent that they reach out to peer colleagues or former program leaders or instructors when they need help that go beyond their school site can provide. In addition to external factors, we're also looking at some of the internal factors, such as self-efficacy. Next slide, please. In terms of the self-efficacy, we're looking, which is kind of capture principals' belief about how well they and the district are executing some of the necessary actions to produce improvement at both the school level and district level. Because of the unique role of principals, their self-efficacy not really reflect not just the individual experiences, but also their school and district experiences. So we asked about how the ability or the belief that they're able to nurture positive change in the school, but also how the district can be successful in recruiting, retaining, and supporting high quality teachers. Another internal or kind of between the internal external factors that was related to connectedness, like the principal's sense of membership and belongings to the school district and the community, and the sense of belongings, or how to what extent that they feel connected to the community members. So after we having those key concepts identified or designing our survey, because that we have a relatively generalized samples that coming from this survey study that represent principals from different demographic background, different gender, racial, ethnic background, principals from different working years of experiences, different educational background, as well as coming from school from different location and type of schools. We were able to looking at how principals' experiences with compassion fatigue, connectedness, efficacy, as well as professional support varied across the different demographic contexts. And so here I'm going to highlight a few findings that we found significant differences across principals from different demographic background. First, finding that we found that gender does matters, especially for professional support. And we found that female principals are more likely seeking for help outside of the support that they can get from the school compared to the male principals. And there were about, the difference is about like 8%, which is more statistically significant. And we also find that multilingual status makes a difference. So principals that speak multiple languages or more than one languages, they are more likely to experiencing or report higher sense of self-efficacy in terms of district level improvement. And as well as the sense of connectedness with the district compared to monolingual principals. And schools location also matters. So when comparing the schools in the rural area to urban and suburban area, we found that principals from rural areas reported higher sense of efficacy as well as connectedness. And then because the principals are joining the study have coming from different years of working experiences, we also looking at how their sense of connectedness varied across the different, it depends on the longevity. And what we found is that with the years of a working experience increased, principals more likely to experience a higher sense of connectedness, even though there are certain career stage that around this year 11 to 15, we did find a little bit drop in terms of the district level connectedness, and that might be related to some of the career specific transitions, as well as could be some sample issues in terms of what the specific groups that we were recruited during that career stage. And some of those findings, I would love to hear your insights in terms of when we move into the conversations to try to make sense. And we have some hypotheses, but I think all of you can provide even more insightful thoughts in terms of how demographic factors that relate to those. And in addition to demographic factors, we also trying to understand those the internal and external resilience and protective factors, to what extent that they can actually reduce or prevent compassion fatigue in terms of both burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And what we found is that those factors all contribute to or related to compassion fatigue to some extent, even though the magnitude of those preventative effects actually vary depending on the variables. For example, professional support standing as a very salient protective factors in terms of promoting well-being and preventing compassion fatigue. And next slide. We also find that those factors do not influence compassion fatigue or well-being independently. They actually interactively influence the principal's well-being. One interesting finding that has been conducted by one of our doctoral students was looking at the interactions between professional support and self-efficacy. And what we found is that compared to professional support, self-efficacy is much stronger preventative factors for compassion fatigue. And you can see that for principals who are experiencing or reporting high sense of efficacies, the level of professional support actually matters less. But for those who are reporting the higher sense of efficacy and also the highest sense of professional support are the ones are experiencing the lowest compassion fatigue. So which help us with really thinking about when we are supporting principals, we have to think about understanding their internal strengths and internal assets and where they are in personally, but also thinking about what kind of some of the matched outside support network that we can provide it to maximize the well-being or maximize the preventative effect of those protective factors. Okay. So far, I have been sharing some of the findings that based on the quantitative data coming from a survey. And another part of very insightful or interesting findings coming from our survey is from the second wave of study. We incorporate into some of the open-ended questions that asking principals that what are some of the effective strategies that they have been used or found successful to help them to navigate those challenging experiences and to help them to cope with or buffering against those stressors. And our wonderful doctoral student, Alan Magstomsky and Arkin Kimberg, they have been trying to make sense of the data and mapping them out in using ecological analysis framework, trying to understand how those resilience factors are located or situated into different ecological systems that are surrounded by principals. Because we believe that principals is not just an isolated individual, their daily work are the product of interaction between the individual experiences, perceptions, beliefs, as well with the multiple layers of the ecological system. So what we found is that I know there's a lot of information in this diagram, but I just want to highlight some of the key resilience factors that has been identified in different ecological layers. And the first one in the middle is individual, or including some of the individual or personal strategies that principals has been using. For example, and this is the area, and this is the area of factors that identified as most effectively in terms of utilizing some of the resilience promoting strategies. So almost over 40% principals has identified some resilience strategies in this individual level, such as taking care of themselves physically, psychologically, and practice positive thinking and develop new hobbies, and also setting up this work-life boundaries. For example, one principal was sharing that I've intentionally strengthened boundaries between work and life, home life, limiting the hours my film is on, and I've been working to increase my time spending on hobbies and other outside activity that give me joy. So the work isn't the only way I'm fulfilled. So that kind of illustrates some of the personal actions and thoughts that could help them to buffer some of the stressors. And in the next outer level of this, we call it microsystem, which is ecological level that close to individual, have the direct contacts with the individual. And some of the resilience factors that identify in that micro level, including some of the social connections and professional connections and support from colleagues, friends, and families. For example, one principal was sharing that there has been a few peers in my district and that are in other schools that I can reach out and talk. We share similar experiences and deal with similar issues. Finding a bit of time to call, email, laugh, and joke about work and life really help bring the perspectives. Without those colleagues who are going through, who can only be called uncharted waters, I could consider walking away. So you can see that how powerful some of those social connections, a sense of belongings and support coming from the colleagues and friends can really make a difference. And also not just those proximal contextual factors matters. They also some of the we call it like a Microsystem, which is basically looking at some of the collective strengths coming out from those microsystems, actually also help to boost some of the resilience. About 10% of principals actually identify that the sense of collective efficacy or the sense of the collective strengths can help them to find the resilience. So one principal was sharing that we relied on our administration team to continue to push our school forward during the time. We have developed a shared responsibility to our goals as a school. So that cultivating that collective care, collective support has been considered as very effective in terms of promoting resilience as a group, as a community. And in the more of the outer ecological system, SO and microsystem, we're looking at some of the district support, which a few principles has been identified as being effective. So they're sharing that our district has organized administrators and has been working through the book like Onward. We do the work and then plan out how to share that what we do with our staff. This has been help our things into perspectives as well as help us staff develop resilience. So the support coming from district does make some difference for some principals. And in addition to all of the school level as well district level support, principal also mentioned about their spirituality, faith and religions, as well as moral and ethical commitment also plays an important role to help them to find resilience during those challenging times. So as you can see from this ecological analysis, principals are drawing from multiple layers of resources surrounding them or within themselves to trying to navigate and negotiate some of the roles that they were executing on a daily basis and trying to find the strengths and using that to empower themselves to do the work. So I think especially by looking at this unbalanced percentage of the resilience factors identified at different ecological level can really help us to thinking about what are some of the level or ecological layers that we haven't been really looking into, and that could be leveraged to help to maximize principles resilience. Okay. So those are the 3 areas or main findings I would like to share today. And as I mentioned before, we do have a longitudinal subsamples that we are now looking into, and has been providing some very insightful and results that or findings. And what we found, we were looking to some of the change of longitudinal patterns based on this almost 50 returning principles. And one interesting finding is that we see the compassion fatigue experiencing by the same group principles significantly increase from wave 1 to wave 2, which is kind of surprising thinking about the drastic transition happening in the beginning of pandemic. But then there's also a potential of delayed impact or delayed negative impact on principles well-being that started to manifest in the later time of a pandemic, which indicate or really suggesting that it's important to think about principles mental health and how we better support them during the time that pandemic seems almost end, but it's actually more principles are on the edge in terms of how they cope and the well-being status. And we also found that some of the district level support and district level sense of efficacy are becoming more and more important as we move through during the pandemic period. And so it is important thinking about what are some of the collective strategies or professional learning opportunity that we can provide it as a group to help to promote that resilience factor, so that principals can get enough support when they are coping added demands and navigating the new change during this time. Okay. So that's the findings I would like to share today, and some of the implications that have been kind of highlighted throughout the presentations. We know that principals are experiencing very high level of stress and compassion fatigue, and some of them very unique to a certain period of time during the pandemic. And we also see that interactive process that principals are experiencing in terms of how they draw different job resources, demands around them from the school community to navigate and promote the well-beings or experiencing the well-being. And there is also some promising findings that looking at some clear tools and processes that principals have been used to help them to buffer against the stressors, execute their functions or roles, which give us some hope in thinking about how we can better support them and how we can leverage those factors and expand it across different ecological levels so that they can get well-rounded support. And that will conclude my presentations. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. That was a lot of very rich content for us to invite our leadership coaches to join. And so please join me in welcoming Santos Gonzalez, who is a leadership coach with 21 CSLA San Diego Riverside Regional Academy. Santos has spent the last 25 years working as a teacher, administrator, and leadership coach in San Diego. Her passion is helping educators develop equity-oriented leadership practices that create powerful outcomes for all students. And she is committed to working in communities that have been historically disenfranchised. And also, please join me in welcoming John Shepard, who is the Director of Secondary Education in Chico Unified School District and also works as a leadership coach in 21 CSLA in the Shasta Geo region. John has been an educator for 28 years as a classroom teacher, coach, activities director, assistant principal, and district level administrator. I'll add leadership coach to that. And most importantly, as a husband and a father. Mr. Shepard understands the importance of developing a passion for learning, and as the Director of Secondary Education in Chico Unified School District, he is continuing to establish a culture of learning through his work as the leader of the middle schools and the high schools. Additionally, John works as the co-coordinator of the Preliminary Administrative Services Credential Program at CSU Chico. Well, as we start, I just want to say that the two of you, Santos and John, are examples of resilient leaders. You've been doing this work for a long time and you keep finding new ways to contribute, which is incredible. And thank you for joining us today and adding your thoughts, especially as you have been supporting leaders through 21 CSLA coaching efforts. We're interested in invite you to join in a dialogue with each other about examples of principal resilience you have witnessed or supported as a coach, some of your reactions and connections to the research findings that were presented by Dr. Young, and also how you might incorporate some of the ideas from this research project into your approach as a coach. So while you're doing that, I just want to remind all of our participants that I'll be collecting questions in the chat that you might have for Dr. Young or for Santos or for John about this issue of principal resilience. Please, Santos, let's get started.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here today to talk about this very important topic. So in terms of examples of principles resilience that I have seen in my role as a leadership coach, there are many things that were highlighted in the research that really rung true to me in terms of what I've been seeing with my principals. The one that kind of stands out for me is really a focus on establishing boundaries. That is something that principals are not known for. They tend to be at the school site all the time. And when they're not at the school site, they're thinking about the school site. So this was a major theme that came up in my sessions with my coachees. And they really understood the need for them to start establishing strong boundaries. And so that was a constant challenge for them, you know, and they had to experiment with things that worked for them. But as time has gone on, they really do see the value in it. And they've seen some improvement in terms of their energy levels, their ability to kind of tackle some of the setbacks that inevitably come up during their day or week. So that was a major one. I would say the other one that has come up is the idea of really focusing on your sphere of control, right? So many things during this pandemic were thrown at everyone, but at school leaders was out of their control, right? And principals really love creating an ecosystem at their school that they can protect, right? So all day they're kind of shielding their staff from distractions, from all sorts of things that can interrupt the work of the school. But they couldn't do that with this, right? So COVID really disrupted this sense of control for them. And that was a big focus for them. Okay, so I can't worry about all that because I can't change that. So what am I going to focus on? Because otherwise I'll feel ineffective, right? Or out of control. So those were the two major ones that have come up with my coachees. And certainly two of the major things that I've been encouraging them to do, in addition to other things, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I don't know, John, have you seen similar things, or have your coachees kind of shown some other strategies that they're employing?
Absolutely. I feel like Dr. Young basically encapsulated our conversations every Tuesday morning when I meet with my admin team. You know, there's just so many nuanced pieces to this. And I do want to thank everyone for coming together. Frankly, doing this is exactly what we need to be doing, and more of this. Knowing, you know, there are 33 people participating in this, and having these conversations is one of those steps that is included, you know, on slide 24, and how we're going to be able to deal with some of these things. You know, I was thinking about this conversation today, and I was talking with some of the experienced leaders that I work with, and then also some less experienced. And it really comes down to them, to predictability. You know, many of them have been trained in LCAP budgets, they've been trained in master scheduling, they've been trained in many things, but they haven't been trained in how to read a mandate on a Monday morning and implement it by 1 o'clock in the afternoon. that's the reality that they're feeling. So the predictable and unpredictable stressors has had a huge impact on leadership capacity. I think for us, that's the driving force behind the decision making. I'm really interested in wave 3, right, Dr. Young, when this goes down the road, because I'd like to see how things are disaggregated then. I am hopefully predicting that we'll see much more of a focus on predictable stressors, things that people have been prepared to deal with. Still very difficult, especially when we're starting to reinforce the absolute necessity for equitable access for all of our kids. But the conversation about predictable and unpredictable, I think, is going to help us down the road. And I was trying to frame this this dilemma, and this may sound archaic for some of you because you've been having this conversation with your own staff for so long. But when we talk about a multi-tiered system of support for students, we also need to be thinking about a multi-tiered system of support for leaders. And we might change academic to intellectual or pedagogy, but we can really contextualize those conversations within those 3, I'll call them backpacks, and trying to figure out, all right, are we talking about a behavior either I would say by a leader or someone who's affecting the leader? It could be staff members. Are we talking about social emotional well-being? So trying to frame it that way, I think, is helpful to deconstruct and prioritize where we need to focus. And that prioritization is where we can sometimes fall into trouble, trying to either start a fire or put a fire out. Conversation we need to have.
We lost the question, so I'm kind of at a loss of where to go next. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Let me help, because we wanted to make sure that we had more of a conversational
Oh,
view.
yes, of course. Let me pull up the questions then on my end. That way.
Yes. Well, while you're doing that, I appreciate these connections that you're making to the research findings. And I wonder if you might have an example of a leader that you supported through a period when they needed to develop their resilience. Do you have an example that you could share so that we can better understand the lived experiences of leaders, especially during this time?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Well, I was thinking, and this is a real base example, our reliance upon technology in the last 18 months to 24 months has been an incredible learning curve. And when we have leaders trying to facilitate educational practice who are struggling with it themselves, the self-efficacy plummets. They're not able to support their teachers or support their students, and it's been a challenge. I know it's a really base example, especially in the rural areas when there aren't as many connections, and we're trying to resolve those. And then we lose some of the populations that need us the most. We can't help them. So we've been working with trying to stay ahead of that with our staff was a challenge.
For me, I can honestly say this week, I don't know what is in the air, but I have had some really intense sessions with my coachees. I think they're hitting a wall that they would normally hit at this time of the year, state testing, wrapping everything up, looking forward to the next year. And on top of that, all the other stressors, right? So this week, some of the things that I've tried to, employ with them, strategies. Okay, so one example, one principal I have, he just had a baby. In fact, he was on, well, his wife did, he did not, but he was on paternity leave for a little while. And that was extremely challenging. He is in his second year as a principal, trying to establish everything. So that was very difficult for him. But one of the things that we got him to commit to was going home to his baby and his wife at 5 o'clock every day as a non-negotiable. And then, of course, he still goes into work every weekend, but there was this sense of you have to put your job in perspective in terms of the totality of what's going on in your life, right? So taking him through this exercise of really establishing those boundaries, but also thinking about his priorities, right? And being okay with what those are. So that's one example. Another example I have found, because most of the people I'm coaching are new principals, and we don't really talk about this a lot, but there has been this process of them mourning their old network and support group of teachers, right? When you make that transition from being a teacher to an administrator, holy cow, I don't think anybody can really accurately capture that change. And so that has been a very big theme that has come up with some of my coachees in the past few weeks. And so one of the things that a few of the things that we've done is, helping them be okay with, that's a natural process of letting go of that. But let's look for evidence in your current role of some of those same kind of things that you're capturing. So for example, one of my coachees was a kindergarten teacher, and now she's an administrator. And so she kept saying, at the end of the year, I used to very clearly see the growth, all the impact that I had. As an administrator, it's not so clear to me. So I said, okay, so let's focus your lens, your principal lens, and figure out what does that look like for your new role? And having them kind of build that muscle of understanding their impact and being fed by that feedback cycle, right? Yes, I'm making an impact. I'm doing good work. I am effective. I think that was really helpful for this one coach in particular that I'm thinking about. So those are a couple of the examples that I have about how to build their resilience, especially right now. They're really struggling. So,
and just to build on that too, Sam, just like I was thinking of some of the data we read earlier in the disaggregation, and I'm wondering if we were to go to those folks that filled out that survey and ask them, were they willing to be vulnerable? Mm-hmm. Were they willing to confirm that there's the reality of these issues and being transparent and communicating that vulnerability to their staff, mm-hmm. with the obvious return of people being able to, maybe commiserate is too strong a word, but work together on some solutions, and then at the very least have a conversation. And I know that especially with beginning administrators, there's a reluctance, to be vulnerable and to not know everything, mm-hmm. kind of going back to the predictable and not predictable, but affirming that there are things outside our control and just putting that into an email, maybe not solving it in the email, asking for solutions, asking for input, creating those mechanisms. So if and when we work out of this, those relationships and that network have been built or reestablished. I think I'm looking at the slide with the slide 24, and the resilience factor related to the exosystem. And as a district administrator, that was the most difficult part for me, was not being able to provide immediate and direct support, mm-hmm. not knowing how things are going to change within the next 24 hours. I can't imagine, what folks above my pay grade were dealing with, knowing most likely they had the same concerns.
I really appreciate how your comments are pointing to how we also develop, or how self-efficacy. So I'm thinking about the example of issue of control, or the issue of boundaries. Is all about helping people to develop behaviors that can help them be more resilient. And I think I can't help but think that good coaches will help our leaders to do some of the things that were reported as positive protective factors in the study. Do you think that there are other ways that coaching and professional support, have you seen in your experiences with 21 CSLA, other ways in which leaders have been positively impacted in terms of the stressors that were named and the factors that help them to be more resilient?
For me, I'm just thinking about the data and try to answer your question. Again, looking at wave 3 down the road, it'd be interesting to see these questions disaggregated by years of experience. I know there was references to some years of experience in there, and then aligning comments, open-ended comments from the people with years of experience with the people, or differentiating between those two groups and what people were thinking when they answered. Knowing though that just because someone's been in a position, for 20 years doesn't necessarily mean that person's going to have all the answers. I do think there's so much teamwork, collaboration, inherent trust that has been built over the past 18 to 24 months because people have been displaying resilience, have been vulnerable, are willing to reach out to each other. It isn't nearly as risky as it's been because we really haven't had the answers, and we've been able to say, I don't know, and I need to find out, or can you help me find out, or do you know someone who knows? And that, having been in administration for a couple of decades, that hasn't always been the case. People have been less willing to reach out, as we saw in the data earlier.
Mm-hmm. So today I had a discussion with one of my coaches. I'm laughing a little bit because the look on her face completely dropped. And she, I told her that it was a 1-year kind of situation that she and I working together. And today she's like, okay, so next year when we work together, I said, I would love that, So she said the reason she really values this particular coaching experience is because, yes, she has some network in her district, but those people are drowning in work too, right? Because they have their own sites to grapple with. And so, yeah, they want to help each other, but the fact is there's not going to be another principal that's going to sit down with her for an hour each week, uninterrupted, prepared to kind of take her through this process of reflection, right? And so for her, this kind of support is unique in that it is completely, it's completely for her. She feels like she has somebody in her corner that is not encumbered with the same stressors and things that her colleagues have to deal with. So I would say that's a unique thing that we provide as CSLA, 21 CSLA coaches. And I really appreciated her saying that because I think it's true. And, full disclosure, I was a principal at the beginning of the pandemic. So wave 1 of this research, I was like, yes. It all made sense to me. And so I know that what she is saying is true, that there was no other kind of support because everybody was scrambling. And so this kind of coaching, I think, is hugely beneficial for principals. And hopefully we can reach as many as possible, because they really need it. They're a constituency in schools that just is not looked after enough, in my humble opinion.
There were some silver linings, like you said, along this pathway, and there are some relationships that have been built between people who, kind of we're all in this together mentality, and finding that support, I think, has really has supported, obviously, the leaders in their own world, right? Meeting people where their feet are, and as we all know, people's feet are in different places right here in this room. So meeting them where they are and moving those individual people forward. As Santos, hearing the compassion and the empathy that you described between the two of you, is going to move her forward, and you met her where her feet were, right? And just that very specific coaching is exactly what this whole 21 CSLA structure has been built upon. The coaching opportunities, the immediate specific, how can I help you? And then the next step, which I've appreciated, we've had opportunities within this structure to share solutions across the state. And regardless of whether we're in Siskiyou County with high schools of less than 100 people, or in Chico with maybe a couple thousand, or in, you know, Orange County with schools of 4,000, the solutions can be shared, and then they can either be implemented, adapted, or discarded. But having these connections, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to bring back Dr. Young soon, but I want to ask one last question about her study that I thought was really interesting and would benefit from more illumination from your perspective, which was about the group that took the Wave 1 survey and the Wave 2, and how they had more compassion fatigue in Wave 2. Now, Wave 2 was after schools had opened, and Wave 1 was in the middle of the shutdown. So does that make sense to you as people who serve leaders, that the compassion fatigue increased between Wave 1 and Wave 2 for the folks that took the survey twice?
Yes.
Yes.
And tell us why. Why do you think that leaders would report increased compassion fatigue over time?
I
Go ahead,
think
Seth. Yeah.
a number of reasons. I think humans can only sustain that level of stress and what's the word that I'm looking for, where you're kind of suppressing your own needs and just, you know, focusing outward in service. I think you can only sustain that at that level for so long. I think they reached a point where that sense of hope was fading. They didn't have it anymore. There was no hope in front of them. And I think they just started to really shut down. It just became too much. You know, it was too much. And obviously there were many other factors, right? The uprising around, you know, race in the country, all those things that were really impactful and that they worried about and brought into the school. And maybe were met with districts or schools that weren't ready to grapple with that on top of all the COVID stuff. So I think it totally makes sense that as the situation wore on, although to the public, it felt like progress to open schools, for them, it still felt helpless. It still felt hopeless, I should say, and difficult and overwhelming. So yeah, that's my take on it. What do you think?
I agree with that. I agree. And going back to the predictability, the unpredictability, the unpredictable stressors were still occurring. And now we're starting to add back in slowly, but adding them back in, the predictable stressors, graduation, promotion, meeting IEP goals, and all the predictable stressors that people have signed up to do. And then I don't want to discount, and actually I think it's paramount, the physical in-person interactions are so much more, I would say they compound any of the stressors, because you're not just listening in a two-dimensional format, you're watching someone's body language, you're interacting with them, you know, in a physical space. You're thinking about what environment did they walk into your office from, you know, kids coming to school, all those. Now these are predictable stressors, but they're right there in front of us again. And then the last thing I can think of when I think of the wave 3 is, what are we going to let go of? What are we going to realize? And this goes back to what Santos said earlier, is out of our control. And moving forward, are we going to prioritize? I'm going to keep coming back to that, knowing that there's still going to be some unpredictable stressors. The goal hopefully will be less of them. One of them that's really painfully obvious right now is our budget and what that's going to look like for our local leaders. But moving forward, you know, how we're going to handle that. So I 100% agree that data is spot on.
Yeah.
Thank you for adding more perspectives into the data. It's really important for us to hear from leaders in the field and those who are serving leaders to better understand how to interpret some of the information that we're getting. So I want to invite Dr. Young back into our question and answer. There's a question for you from someone in the audience that's in the chat, Dr. Young. In your investigation of principal self-efficacy, You describes leaders' perceptions of their ability to nurture positive change in their schools. And so this person wants to know if any of the respondents to the survey connected positive change with equity or issues of equity. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, so thank you so much for that question. I think one of the thing this question makes me thinking about not just like a leader's response, but also connected back to some of the teachers' response in the teacher resilience survey. We find kind of similar patterns or themes looking at teachers are both teacher and principals are reflect on a lot of in terms of the white premises and then racism and how that impact the underserved population that they were working with. And I just want to drop in one of the quotes that coming from, I thought it was very compelling, that was coming from teachers, and also another one from the principal, so that you can see some of the principal does practice some of the reflections coming from during that when they thinking about working with kids with needs, especially during this precedented time. Give me 1 second, I'm just trying to. This is one of the principal, one of the teachers' response, and really, I think some of the, especially thinking about educators that from the majority background and how they when they seeing the trauma or experience the negative experiences by the students, and how that help them to reflect and thinking about the needs. Here I have Meg, one of our doctoral students who had things conducting some of the thorough data analysis, and she was sharing one of the quotes that was also very powerful to really thinking about the positive change. And Meg, feel free to jump in if any of the insights. I know have been working on those data for such a long time, and then you know the data much better than me. So feel free to add in any insights. And in this quote, the principals was talking about how they try to state on the personal beliefs about education, the roles of ending the inequity and racism in the community. And I use the data to grant my emotion and remain logical and committed to outcomes. And throughout the pandemic, the inequity has been magnified and the impact on our students and the family has been terrible, but I use this as a motivation. So it's a kind of like finding that empowerment from those experiences to make changes to end inequity practices and policies to drive change. I also make times to communicate with people in our community, find the joy and strengths while understanding the perspective I try to celebrate as we work. So we can see that the principals, when they are experiencing those stressors, they also trying to find the empowerment and to get that growth coming out of it. It's like kind of turning the lemon into lemon juice that we talk about, that thriving piece.
Thank you for that. I heard John and Santos already wondering a lot about wave 3. And so I think maybe it would be a good time for us to think about this longitudinal study and what's next. So do you want to describe a little bit about the plans that you have? And then I would like to invite John and Santos to add some suggestions or ideas for what we should investigate in wave 3.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Santo and John, for your insights and really help me to thinking about what we are going to add more or expand our wave 3 study. I think one of the area from our first 2 wave studies, a lot of in terms of the well-beings, we have been focused a lot on identifying and understanding and thinking about strategies how to counterback some of the risk factors and how do we capture that risk or stressors. But to some extent, I think, John, you made a very good point in thinking about to provide the opportunity for leaders to feel vulnerable and share the vulnerability. I think that is also a way to generating the strength and empowerment. But at the same time, we're also hoping to see how we shift gradually or just like expanding that perspective, not just staying down to deficit perspective, but also adding that strengths-based perspective, really thinking about principles of well-being and resilience as a comprehensive construct, really thinking about it as in the mental health research, we talk about mental health as a complete mental health models, looking at both the symptoms, but also the fulfillment, satisfaction, that positive side of mental health. So I think that is one component we want to add in the wave 3, in addition to capture the hardship, the challenges they're experiencing. We're also hoping to capture the fulfillment, the silver lining, and the thriving that they're potentially experiencing as they move forward. So one of the concepts we've been kind of piloting in our teacher resilience study is looking at the compassion satisfaction, which give us that shift, and from only looking at deficit or a risk perspective, but also adding that strengths-based, so that we can have a better understanding about teachers' experiences or principal experiences. And for our research, we found that principals and teachers can actually experiencing both. It's not either or. It's not just they can only experiencing stress and cannot experiencing fulfillment. So how do they balance that, or how do they utilize those the strengths of positiveness to combat that risk? I think that's one of the area we want to focus on. And we also want to moving from this more descriptive, observational design of study to looking at some of the actionable design, is really thinking about, we talk a lot about this collective structures, talk about ecological systems, like professional support seems to be very promising factors to support resilience. But we also want to understand, like, how do we capture that ecological system surrounded by principles? We've been piloting that using network analysis to looking at teachers' social support and professional support, really thinking about what is a network looks like, and who they are seeking for help. What are some roles of those supporters are? So, and what's the nature of the support that different roles are providing? So I think that will be another component that we want to add in to really map out this ecological system in the survey study, because by just asking some Likert scale survey questions is kind of limited. We couldn't capture that multi-dimensional perspective, but I think using network analysis can help us to really map out that.
Thank you. Santos and John, do you have other ideas for what we should study in wave 3?
I definitely have my areas of interest that I'm curious to know a little bit more about. For me, you know, looking at, there was a slide that suggested there was a difference between how women experience support or how they started out. I am interested to know, you know, how women and men have experienced leadership differently through this whole situation. Because, you know, there's data that shows that women left the workforce at like huge numbers because of stressors of daycare or caring for whatever, you know, a bunch of reasons. And so I'm interested to see how that played out in the principalship. The other thing I'm interested in seeing more about is how principals of color kind of experienced this whole period of time, because I think it was uniquely impactful to them personally, but also to their communities, because, you know, COVID disproportionately impacted Brown and Black communities. So I would love to see that, just because personally, that was a big impact on my own leadership, you know.
Thank you. Also, I think we collected demographic information on multilingual leaders. Be interested to understand more about why multilingual leaders feel more connected and more efficacious. John, please.
Yeah, Santos, I couldn't agree more. And the only other thing I can think of right now would be to consider socioeconomic status and of the school districts, obviously not of the leaders themselves, and how they're handling some of the different situations and using their funding streams, knowing, and this is where I think wave 3 is critical, knowing the ESSER funding is going away, right? We have roughly a year left in most cases, and I don't know of another wave coming. And boy, I hope someone has some information about that, but an unpredictable stress and how that's going to impact delivery of services and the stress related to making those decisions about how you're going to deliver or prioritize the services for students and for staff. That's going to be a monumental task for leaders, and having people be able to have those conversations and rational rationalize why they prioritized things the way they have, going back to the conversation about, equitable access for all kids. So I think that it'd be interesting to see from a socioeconomic status perspective how districts are making decisions and the impacts of making those decisions on their self-efficacy, the stressors that have been created by those decisions.
Two other ideas that just occurred to me as we've had this discussion this afternoon. One is about this idea of the compounded nature of the stress over time or delayed response, however you want to see it. But in either case, I wonder if that's something we can measure in wave 3 more broadly than just our repeat respondents. In other words, to think about, I think there are some people who think that things are going back to the way they used to be, or that things are going back to normal because maybe we're not wearing masks everywhere, or maybe because children are back on their regular schedules. What I've heard in your comments today and in the study results is that we are far from going back to the way things were. Things were already difficult. They got worse during the pandemic, just less visibly, more invisibly. Kids and teachers and educators brought all that invisible stress with them back to schools. And now, as John said, what are we not going to do anymore? Because now we've created a very untenable situation for educators and students. And so I think that kind of illustration of compounding stress coupled with assumptions, working assumptions around what is reasonable, what is doable, and also what is the state of education right now is a really interesting set of tensions that I've heard arise from this conversation. Is there anyone who'd like to add any other comments about that in particular?
Well, it's interesting whenever I hear going back to the way it was, there's two ways to look at that, right? And I think there are definitely some aspects that we are really wanting, stability, we want COVID to go away, all those things. But then there's this other meaning to it about like the way we did business, right? The way we worked with kids. I think when we enter into the next school year, if districts are unwilling to kind of push, I think principals are going to become more and more dissatisfied because they're going to feel less efficacious, that their organizations don't have the courage to deal with the issues that they need to be dealing with. That's my guess. That's my prediction. Maybe that's my hope. I don't know. Maybe I want, principals to really push that change, but that's kind of my addition to that topic. Yeah.
I want to go back to hearing Dr. Young talk about wave 3 and some, not just trying to identify the challenges, but what have been the positive results of addressing those challenges. And I can tell you from a rural perspective, in the corner of California, having the ability to collaborate through technology and hearing perspectives that are nearly as vocally represented in communities, yet are definitely perspectives and the people are living it in these communities up here, and not addressing equity issues. Now having an understanding that there are these resources available to us really quickly and easily, I think that's going to influence a lot of decision making, a lot of policy advancement, maybe even removal. So I'm really excited about that. I don't want to call it the new normal because that's too politicized, but down the road, having these kind of collaborative conversations is definitely going to positively influence our kids' experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Another theme that I heard that hasn't been named yet about wave 3 is around issues of isolation.
Mm.
So as I heard you describe some of the experiences of leaders, particularly Santos, when you described the new administrator, for instance, who was previously a teacher, I was thinking about how we've long known that leadership is isolating. You are more isolated because there are fewer leaders at a school site than teachers, and there can be, it can take a while to build camaraderie. So I'm just also wondering if there's a way for us, and then I think about physical distancing because of the public health mandates or other health related issues. And so we now have multiple forms of isolation. We've also had prolonged isolation in distance working environments. And now we're returning to the intensity of in-person working environments, which is a different type of intensity. And so I wonder too about thinking about issues of isolation of different types and how that might have an impact on issues of compassion fatigue or burnout, or even possibly on protective factors, because in some cases those isolations and this distance were protective. And so there's this duality in the issue that I think could be investigated more.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the conversation we had before is about the boundary, and it's kind of related to the isolation piece. And what we see from our teacher study, we also find that there is a dual role in terms of the what is a boundary and isolation or connection. Like when teachers are experiencing or reaching out to students, especially those are experiencing elevated trauma experiences, they actually if they're not keeping the boundary in healthy ways, and that actually added more traumatic stress. So I think when we think about supporting leaders, we also have to think about what is considered as healthy boundary, and what is the healthy practice of that boundary, and what kind of connectedness that we want to make it happen, but some of the connectedness might not have to, like, we have to avoid. I think it is very interesting question to thinking about the boundary and the connectedness piece, and also that isolation. Like some teachers or principal working with student with challenging behavior before the pandemic. So when they moved to virtual and distant learning, they actually see the stress dropped in terms of that, because that less of this face-to-face interactions. So how do we still keep some of the practices, but then promote that healthy boundary practice? I think that's important.
Thank you. And one of the most special parts about this study is that and this webinar today, is that it is absolutely connected with 21 CSLA, which is providing the community and the professional learning of many leaders, for many leaders across California. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't end today's session by saying that you can sign up to have your principals participate in the Wave 3 study, because we will want to capture the voices of as many principals as possible, that there are opportunities to sign up for leadership coaching, free 25 hours of support individualized to leaders across the state at the teacher site and district lead levels. And they're offered by each of our regional academies. And on slide 31, we've provided links to all of these ways to stay connected, to hear about the news, to also participate and sign up for leadership coaching. And finally, to say that one final offering that we're providing here at the end of year 2 for 21 CSLA is an Inquiry Now series, 2 days of in-person workshops. Imagine that. And so come and get reconnected and talk to your colleagues about what inquiry-based learning looks like. I hope you'll join me in thanking Dr. Young and also John and Santos for being with us today for this incredibly important topic. This webinar will be archived and located on the 21 CSLA State Center for those of you who are, would like to share it with a colleague, or to use it in one of your professional learning events in your district or your work location. And finally, we invite you to take our feedback survey. We use your feedback to improve our webinars. We will start with webinar 10 in the fall. Thank you so much for joining us today.